We're in session.
This could be a lightning if you want.
Oh,
Should
yeah. Good call.
be. Live stream?
Yeah. No, not live stream. That stream. All right. I hope everybody's comfortable. Got what you need to drink or
Did you turn it on?
snack. Yeah, it's a video.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
You turned it on.
You a little right. Is it too bright over there? Not
Nope.
to your eye, right? Okay. Yeah, thanks everybody for coming. Happy New Year. I've been, for those who are new here, only two actually. Three, Ernie. We've been doing, I started this group, it's called Geopolitical Group. I added the this year, so the Geopolitical Forum. Started in April 2023. We started doing this in the Marriott lobby. For some who have been here for long enough, you probably remember those days. Then October 2023, we moved to this office space. And then to this day. And this year, we're gonna do a lot of lecture-based as opposed to conversation-based as we have experienced in the past. So it's great. We have lineup 5. Lecture-based is either here, like we do today, or we do the Chicago Council on Foreign Affairs. Then you naturally have a panel of experts, so it's lecture-based, or college of complexes. There's always a volunteer speaker keynote, so that's lecture-based. That's what I'm aiming to do for this year. We have next one, we have Ethan talking about his trip 2 weeks from now, today. But the other ones this month, it's either at Chicago Council of Foreign Affairs at Prudential Plaza or college complexes in Addison Street. Okay, so today the topic is George Orwell. It's the best known for his 1984 and Animal Farm, among others. Certainly, he has the adjective Orwellian to his name, and also enriches our lexicon with stuff like Big Brother, Thought Police, Room 101. I got it from the internet. I never heard of it. Must be from somewhere. Newspeak. I think people use it. It's from somewhere he wrote. Memory Hole, Double Think, and Thought Crime. Oh, Thought Crime, I know that one. So who better than Dr. David Ramsay Steele to bring Orwell back alive today for us? Dr. Steele has written, he's the author of library books, among those like 1 or 2 Orwell topic, and one of those is chapter 10 in this. So Dr. Steele also writes about economics, capitalism, Marxism, socialism, fascism, psychotherapy, etc. So it's very exciting to have him speaking about an iconic author, George Orwell, at our first event of 2025. I think that's it. Take it over.
Okay. I think it was Adolf Hitler who pioneered the idea of several seconds of complete silence before you start talking. So, that was involuntary in that particular respect. Okay, so I wrote this book about Orwell. It came out in, when did it come out? I can't remember now. 2012 maybe, no, a bit later. Anyway, so let me make a commercial announcement. I've got some of my books here. I've got 2 of my books here, and I'm prepared to sell them at what I pay for them, which I have to pay 60% of the list price plus shipping. So these are both list prices $30, so I'm prepared to sell both of them at $20, and I'm prepared to throw in a priceless autograph and inscription, which could mean that your grandchildren will become fabulously wealthy. Orwell. I was interested in Orwell all my life, really. I first read Orwell in the 1950s, and I read a lot of Orwell, including lots of his lesser-known pieces in the 1960s. What really got me going about Orwell and got me to write a book about it was that I was irritated by the fact that people often make mistakes when they ascribe certain beliefs or convictions to Orwell. And so the first thing I wrote about Orwell, I think, was a review of the Christopher Hitchens book. As we got closer to 1984, there was a growing sort of interest in Orwell, and the sales of Orwell's books skyrocketed, and lots of books were written about Orwell. So Christopher Hitchens wrote this book, which in the United States was called Why Orwell Matters. In Britain it was called something different. He made several mistakes about Orwell's beliefs. So my book on Orwell is, and my particular focus on Orwell in what I'm going to talk about tonight, is what did Orwell believe? What were his convictions? What was his Weltanschauung? Because even now I keep finding mistakes about this. So I have discovered, since I wrote that book actually, what I'm going to say is all in that book, but it's not arranged this way. I gave a lot of talks about Orwell in the years immediately following my book. And I discovered that in order to counter various misconceptions about Orwell's thinking, it was a good approach to this is to talk about Orwell's changes of mind, because there were points in Orwell's life where he radically changed his beliefs on some important topic. I would say there are several reasons why people do get Orwell wrong, quite apart from the fact that every famous person is usually got wrong by people who write about them. They usually make mistakes, learning about intellectual history and history in general is learning that things you thought were true are not true. Marie Antoinette never said, "Let them eat cake." You learn all these things, and you learn that these things never happened. Then you can start to learn maybe a little bit about what might have happened. So apart from that, one reason why people get Orwell wrong is that Orwell is a very good persuasive writer, and he's a persuasive writer of a particular kind. Many people find as they read Orwell that they really like him, and they think that his ideas seem very plausible because of the way he puts it, and they feel they're very friendly towards Orwell. And as a result, if they come across something in Orwell that seems a bit problematic, they try to excuse it or adapt it to what they think it should be. And a simple example of this would be Christopher Hitchens refers to the fact, which is well attested and easy to confirm, that Orwell had some kind of hostility towards homosexuality, and of course in the 1930s, 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, which is Orwell's period, this was very common on the left. I mean, there was in fact a kind of strong macho element in a lot of socialist thinking in those days, and the idea that homosexuality was in some way a symptom of decadent capitalism was a very common idea on the left in the English-speaking world at that time. So Christopher Hitchens says that Orwell struggled to overcome the involuntary shudder which heterosexuals feel when they're confronted with homosexuality. This is just baloney. Orwell was extremely blasé about homosexuality, and there's no sign of any involuntary shudder. Orwell was against homosexuality because of it. He accepted a theory that civilization was in a decadent phase. And it links up with his distaste for fruit juice drinking, sandal wearing, vegetarianism, birth control, a whole men who wore shorts. There was a whole bunch of things like this that he really found distasteful, and that most people in England at the time found a bit strange, at the very least. And so Orwell had this commitment to this this idea that civilization was in a decadent phase. And at this time in the 1930s, one of the hot topics was the decline in the birth rate, and the fact that maybe the English people, or maybe the white race, or maybe the civilized peoples were going to lose their place and something horrible was going to come along and replace them. So that was a very popular idea at the time, and Orwell shared in it and often endorsed these ideas. So that's an example of somebody who Hitchens really loved Orwell, and he couldn't believe that what people do when they find Orwell saying something they really dislike is they acknowledge that he's saying something they dislike, but they think it's an emotional thing, and they find a good excuse for this emotional thing. And really, Orwell objected to homosexuality in exactly the same way that he objected to great differences in wealth and income. It was part of an elaborate worldview, but people treat these differently. Anyway, so another reason why people get Orwell wrong is because Orwell changed his mind. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk about 5 points in Orwell's life where he changed his mind. And I'll briefly tell you what they are, and then I'll go back over them. So the first big change of mind was in 1927. Orwell had spent 5 years as a police officer in Burma, which is now called Myanmar. And he came back on leave, went to his home where his father and mother and sisters lived, and he appalled and astonished them by saying, if you became a reasonably high-ranking official in the British Empire, it was expected you would stay there until you retired. But he'd been 5 years in Burma, and he told his family that he was, and he meant it, that he wasn't going to go back. He was going to stay in England, resign from the imperial service, and become a writer. And up until this point, from the point of view of Orwell's family, he turned out quite well. This is the first sign of something really disconcerting and disappointing happening. So I have to explain here something that is necessary for people in the American linguistic sphere to understand. In Britain, the term public school means an elite private school. That's what it means. It means it today, and it meant it in the 1920s. In the 1920s, it would always be a single-sex school, and all the famous public schools would be boys' schools, but there were girls' public schools as well. And that they would, generally speaking, they'd all be boarding schools. So if you rose to a reasonably eminent position in British life at that time, and even today there's still a sort of weird echo of it. You would get rid of your kids for most of the year. You'd send them to boarding school, and you'd pay hefty fees, and they would become, essentially, they'd become candidate members of the ruling class. And this is one thing you have to understand about Orwell. He had a ticket into the ruling class. Orwell won a scholarship to the most prestigious public school, which is Eton, E-T-O-N. For many, many years, more than 2/3 of the cabinet. Britain had a system of cabinet government as people discovered eventually. More than 2/3 of the cabinet would always be old Etonians. If you've been to Eton, you would automatically know a lot of people who became eminent, and so you'd be well connected. So Orwell passed a test. His parents had sent him to a prep school, and so he then took this test, and he got a scholarship to Eton. So of course, most of the people at Eton were quite wealthy, but he wasn't, because his parents were not wealthy. They were well off by the average working class standards, but not particularly wealthy. Orwell was born in India. He was born in Motihari in Bengal, and his father had a good job in the imperial administration. Orwell's father's job was being in charge of inspecting the opium crop that would be exported to China and making sure the quality was good. I always find this a little bit amusing, but that was his job. And he retired when Orwell was in his 20s. So the family was reunited in England. This was a big deal that Orwell, who looked as though he was very promising, didn't go to university, but instead, when he left Eton, he went straight into the Imperial Police Force, and he was stationed in Burma for 5 years. And his first novel is all about his life in Burma. I mean, it's a fictional thing, of course, but it closely follows many of the things that happened to him in Burma. So this was now. Okay, so let me briefly say the other 4 times that Orwell made a big change. The second big change in Orwell's mind was when he became a socialist. After having been definitely an anti-socialist in the beginning of the 30s, although he had flirted with socialism when he was 18 years old, but still, he was definitely an anti-socialist in 1935. He became a convert to socialism, and that was while he was writing a book that was to be called The Road to Wigan Pier, and in that book he actually states that he is a recent convert to socialism. So that's the second big thing. So
how old is Orwell at this time period? How old is he during this time?
So he was born in 1903. So when he came back from Burma, he would have been 24. So he decided to become a writer. So then he converted to socialism in 1936. So there's a fair length of time when he was writing material, but he was not a socialist. Then he became a socialist in mid-1936, and from then on he was always a socialist. He died. He had a fairly short life. He died in January 1950, so he was 46 years old when he died. So all that time, so a lot of people who read Animal Farm and 1984 assume that Orwell was anti-socialist, but he was not anti-socialist, or at least not consciously. He was definitely a committed, in fact, a very dogmatic and doctrinaire socialist. So that happened in 1936. The next big change was only a year later, and that was can be dated to something completely surprising and shocking that happened to him on May 3rd, 1937. And I'll explain what that is and what that was in a moment. He was fighting in Spain at that time for the left. The Spanish Civil War was going on. Left-wingers from all over the Western world were going to fight in Spain. That many thousands, and many thousands died fighting in Spain. And Orwell went to fight in Spain for the left against the nationalists under Franco. The next big change of his mind occurred, and this can be dated remarkably almost to the hour. It was in the early morning hours of August 23rd, 1939, when he switched very suddenly from being a dedicated opponent of the coming war with Germany to being a very enthusiastic supporter of this coming war with Germany. At that point, everybody knew that a war was coming with Germany. And it was a question of what you thought about this. And people on the extreme left, which I'm using that as a sort of handy term, is not very precise. Generally speaking, at that point in time, were opposed to a war with Germany for reasons that go back to the First World War and so on. So that was an overnight switch, literally overnight, because he woke up in the early hours of the morning and realized that he would support the war, and from then on he became an enthusiastic supporter of the war. And then finally there was a big change in his outlook, which is less easy to pin down exactly, but it's certainly 1942, between 1942 and 1945 there was a big change in his outlook. The main thing about that was that, having been a revolutionary socialist in the sense of an insurrectionary socialist, talking about the gutters running with blood and things like that, he became a parliamentary socialist. So that was the fifth. So those are the 5 things. So I'll just say a bit more about each of these 5 things.
But can you just differentiate between parliamentary socialists and revolutionary?
Right. In Britain, Britain has long had a 2-party system. What that means is, if you have a system where each district elects by a plurality, then that automatically tends to generate a 2-party system. Whereas if you have a system of proportional representation, that automatically tends to generate a multi-party system in which there's constant dickering about with coalitions of minority parties, like we see in Germany today, or Israel, or a lot of countries in the world. But in countries like the United States and Britain, which have it's called in Britain first past the post, meaning the candidate with the most votes wins, even if they're a minority of the vote. In the 1920s, the Liberal Party was replaced by the Labour Party. These 2 parties, they used to be called the Whigs and the Tories. They changed their name to the Liberals and the Conservatives, but a lot of people still refer to them, they still refer to the Conservative Party as the Tories, right? And then in the 20s, the Liberals were replaced by Labour, the Labour Party. The Labour Party was controlled and totally governed at its outset by being a trade union party. The trade union, what Americans call labor unions, they have in Britain, they've always had a very unified structure. All the trade unions join something called the Trade Union Congress. And basically the trade unions, if you were a typical working man in Britain, you paid your union dues and a percentage of that went to the Labour Party. So that's how the Labour Party was financed. And the Labour Party, after 1918, the Labour Party it was called the Labour Representation Committee in 1900. It became the Labour Party, the name, purely a change of name, in 1906. And then later, I think 1918, it adopted a socialist commitment to socialism in its platform. So there were these clauses that you had to agree to if you joined the Labour Party, and this became famous as Clause 4, which is the common ownership of the means of production, distribution, and exchange. Right. So that's, in other words, common ownership, although people hate to admit it, means government ownership. Right. So the Labour Party had formed two governments as a minority party, relying upon liberal votes. So this is at a time when the Labour Party kept increasing its vote in Parliament, where the Liberals kept on declining. And then in 1945, there was a landslide Labour victory after the end of the Second World War. So being a democratic socialist, arguing for socialism to be brought about through Parliament was a very huge and established thing in Britain. So in the period where Orwell, where Orwell was what I call a revolutionary anti-Stalinist leftist, he held most of the views that revolutionary anti-Stalinist leftists held. And one of these would be the more or less the inevitability of a violent revolution. So they were sort of like Bolsheviks, but they were opposed to Stalin. This is a very common view. And they weren't, a lot of these people were Trotskyists. And a lot of people referred to Orwell as a Trotskyist, and it's not accurate. He was never in fact, he was never a Marxist, although he held a lot of views that were congruent with Marxism in that period. And so anyway, but it's good that you asked the question, because then I can explain it. So does anybody else have any questions? Okay, I've got lots more to say. Orwell, after Orwell came back to England and became a freelance writer, he had some savings, and he had a kind of partial pension from the Burmese police force, and he had a few other odds and ends. He wasn't wealthy, but he was able to subsidise his living for a year or two. But he also kept on writing articles, but he also wrote books. And of course, at first writing prose didn't come easily to him, and he had to work at it hard. But his first book came out in 1933. Yes, so the thing I didn't explain was that when he decided to become a writer, he decided that his first specialty as a writer was going to be living with tramps and hobos and down and outs and writing about his experiences, right? So this was to those who are in touch with English letters, this was an established genre. You know, Jack London, after becoming famous as a writer of adventure stories, went to London and chose to live among the London poor, and wrote about it. And he wrote, it's called People of the Abyss, is London's book. And Robert Louis Stevenson wrote a book about living with the poor. And there was a book which was very famous in its day called Autobiography of a Supertramp by W.H. Davis. So there were these, this was a recognized genre. So Orwell did this. He put on shabby clothes and turned up at places where tramps congregated, including charitable places that looked after tramps. And he got into the tramp community and started to write about it. And then he went to France, and in France he was swindled out of what little money he had, and he became a plongeur, which is a washer-up in restaurants. So he had experience of living at a really poor level in Paris. There were lots of Brits and Americans who went to Paris at that time. In fact, Paris was considered the intellectual, cultural leader of the world, and everybody who was an aspiring intellectual had to go there. But Orwell didn't meet any of these other aspiring intellectuals because he was very poor. So most of these other aspiring intellectuals were reasonably well-to-do, and they hung out on these fashionable cafes in Montmartre. But Orwell was actually living at the lowest level. Then he came back to England and spent some more time with tramps. And so he wrote a book called Down and Out in Paris and London. And that was when he adopted the name George Orwell. I've been talking about him as George Orwell. His real name, this is the name on his birth certificate, and it's also the name on his tombstone, is Eric Arthur Blair, B-L-A-I-R. So he made that change of name for Down and Out in Paris and London. And then after that he wrote the novel Burmese Days, which is quite a good novel about the life of a policeman, a police officer in Burma.
Was there some significance to the name, George Orwell?
That's an interesting question. There are two views on that question, and they're both wrong. One of them is that it's just purely a casual adoption of a nom de plume, and it has no significance. And the other interpretation is that it marks there were several books written by a couple of people, Lansky and somebody else, arguing that there was this big transformation in Orwell's life, and it was symbolized by the name change. That's wrong as well. What the truth is that, first of all, that he did have to come up with a name for Down and Out in Paris and London, and unrealistically, he thought, well, if the book doesn't do very well, I'll do my next book with a different name. That would try out this one. Of course, that's totally unrealistic, a view of things. But anyway, but having chosen that name, it was much more than a pen name, because everybody who got to know him after that point knew him as George Orwell. And many of them didn't know that he had been Eric Blair. Just as many people who had known him as Eric Blair didn't know that that's the helpful deep state is cutting off spam calls. So so that I'm not bothered, right, and feel grateful to them. So Orwell used this name, and people who had known him as Eric Blair when they started to read about George Orwell, a lot of them didn't know who that was. So that on both ends there was this thing, because he was telling everybody he was George Orwell. Now there is another angle to this. And it's this: Orwell hated the name Eric, and he hated Scottishness. He hated both those things. In a strange way, this links up with this commitment to degeneration theory and to dislike for homosexuality, because of course Eric Blair has a somewhat limp-wristed sound to it, right? Whereas George Orwell, what could be more masculine than that, right? So this is you can detect this if you read everything about Orwell. So this is he really did hate Eric and Blair, and one of the reasons he hated, Blair is a Lowland Scots name, as is Ramsay and as is Steele, it was part of the public school ethos that that Scots were a model of frugality and strength and courage and so on. So he was, as a child, he was constantly being bombarded with this idea that the Scots were wonderfully virtuous people, and he sort of, as you probably know, Orwell had a bit of a rebellious spirit, and so that turned him off. But also when he went to Burma, he got the idea that the most obnoxious of the imperialists in the way they treated the natives and everything else were the Scots. So he had that fixed view. So he had this anti-Scottish view, and so anyway, I've probably said enough about the name change. His second wife, who his first wife died unexpectedly, but his second wife, she always called herself, her maiden name was Sonia Brownell. She always called herself Sonia Orwell. And so technically she might have been Sonia Blair because she'd married Eric Blair. But that's an example of this pervasiveness of the Orwell name. It wasn't just it wasn't simply a nom de plume, and at the same time the name change doesn't correlate with one of these major shifts in its outlook, right? The major shift in his outlook came in 1927, and then in 1936. Those were the big changes, so Orwell was very much an Etonian, very much a public school thing, and part of that is hard work and dedication. And once he'd set his mind to becoming a writer, he was the kind of writer who originally wasn't very good at handling words. But he set himself a word count for each day, right? So there are some writers who've done that. Maybe if I'd done that in my life, I would have been more of a success. But anyway, it's not in my nature to do that. But so he would say, I've got to write, I'd forget what the number was actually, I've got to write 10,000 words today. And he would stick to it and keep on writing, no matter how bad it was, until he'd written the 10,000. Well, that's one way to learn to write. So actually, from the years 1933 to 1940 inclusive, that's 8 years, he published one book a year. And that's remarkable because he was making his living by publishing these little reviews and short pieces. But that was what he was fundamentally relying on. But he published, and some of those were novels. One or two of the novels are not that great, and he regretted having published them. The worst of his novels is called A Clergyman's Daughter, and as his death approached, because Orwell knew he was close to death at the end of his life. The last year of Orwell's life, he was just an invalid, and in the sanatorium where he was living, they took his typewriter away because they didn't want him to stress himself with work. So he was conscious, and he replied to letters, and he clarified some of his views. But he had ideas for future novels and things, and he kept on having these ridiculous, hopeful ideas that there was going to be a wonder drug that would save him, but it didn't, and he died sort of 12 months after he more or less knew he was going to die. Any questions at this point?
Yeah, so what are the key takeaways from this first novel about Burma, and how does that differ from what he's writing about later after he turns into a socialist?
Right. Well, by the way, when I say the first big change, somebody might object that was just a change in his plans for his life, that he chose not to be a Burmese policeman and then instead to become an English freelance writer. But it is related to more profound changes in his outlook, but it's clear that by the time he decided in 1927 not to go back to Burma, he was a very fierce enemy of the empire, you might think that would mean he would be left, but he was very skeptical about the left and was not at that point a committed socialist at all. I mean, he is supposed to have accepted the term that was applied to him at that point as a Tory anarchist. So in other words, sort of an old-fashioned conservative, but an anarchist. But he gave all that up to become a socialist.
So
and
something like Millet?
What's that?
Maybe something like Javier Millet?
Oh no, that you see, Javier Millet is a libertarian, or at least that can be claimed. I'm a libertarian, something I know something about. So Orwell was not a libertarian. I mean, in the sense that he was never wholeheartedly in favor of the free market. There was no point in his life where he was ever wholeheartedly in favor of the free market. I mean, there are a couple of articles which I cite in my book by a guy, I think his name was Eckstein, an American scholar of Orwell, who wrote a couple of articles drawing attention to the fact that Orwell was for a socialist, Orwell was amazingly sympathetic to laissez-faire capitalism. But the problem there is that Orwell thought there were lots of good things about the world before the First World War, and it's about England before the First World War, which were being lost. So in a sense, but the other side of that was that he thought that the things that were coming to dominate were absolutely inevitable, and there was no way of resisting them. So this is the thing about Orwell. When Orwell became a socialist, generally speaking, this is a feature of English socialism at that time, that most people who became socialists, and by the way, I should say that to be a socialist in the 1930s did not mean that you wanted a slightly bigger welfare state or anything like that. It meant that you wanted everything to be owned by the government. That's what it meant. There were a few little socialist groups who held a different view of what socialism meant, but there was an overwhelming consensus among people who called themselves socialists in the 30s that it meant everything owned by the government and every individual being a government employee and differences in income being very small, much reduced. They usually weren't in favour of total equality of income, but much less, and all property incomes being abolished. It also meant, one has to say, a belief in freedom of speech and democracy. All these socialists in England, there are a few like George Bernard Shaw who you might say didn't like that aspect of it, but basically socialists were utterly committed to democracy and free speech as well. But of course, lots of other people who weren't socialists. Whereas the distinguishing features of socialism was the government to own everything. And Orwell actually explicitly said this on a number of occasions.
How did the monarchy fit into?
Oh, there would be no monarchy, of course.
Okay, so
yeah.
they were.
I mean,
Orwell and the socialists were all anti-monarchy.
Yeah, I mean, they were not particularly. That was not particularly a big thing they talked about a lot. There is a play by George Bernard Shaw about a future socialist England where there is still a monarch, and the sort of it's a sort of jokey thing that the monarch is the only hope for freedom in this, because George Bernard Shaw was, although he was a socialist, he had a kind of disinterested, objective view of certain things going on, and he also liked paradox. The monarchy at that time was very, very popular, and if the Labour Party had come out in favour of abolishing the monarchy, for example, that would have sunk them. So the people who became Labour Party voters, very staunch Labour Party voters, but abolish the monarchy, what? Never crossed their minds. So, but generally speaking, the intellectuals, I mean, one of the things about Orwell was that he became, in 1936, he became a socialist and a conscious member of the left. And he identified with the left, and he kept talking about it. At the same time, he was very critical of the left. And in fact, it's often been pointed, it's very obvious. If you read The Road to Wigan Pier, it's in two parts with almost exactly equal size. The first part, I should say something about The Road to Wigan Pier, because it's very crucial for understanding all that. In the 1920s, most of the Western world was experiencing a boom. Britain was experiencing a slump. The usual explanation given for this is the decision after the First World War. They paid for the First World War by a lot of inflation. And that means they temporarily broken the gold standard in order to enable them to inflate the currency. And after the First World War, they went back to a gold standard at the old parity, the pre-war parity. And anybody here who's done economics knows what that means. It means that all prices and all wages have to be reduced, right? And as Lord Keynes taught us, so we all knew anyway, there is something called the money illusion, that workers will accept a decline in their real income caused by rising prices much more readily than they will accept an actual reduction in their nominal income by a wage cut, right? So that's why it's an easy thing for the government to do. So Orwell, so you had this situation in the 20s where England was in slump. And then in the 30s, when there was a general slump, the slump got even worse in England. However, it was disaggregated. There were parts of England which boomed in the 30s. And this is often forgotten now. But generally speaking, the home counties, which is the counties around London, there were people who were better off than they'd ever been in the 1930s. It's not great, right? They'd never been particularly wealthy, but that was a lot of people. So you had this division of the nation into the more prosperous areas, or especially the home counties, although there were islands of this prosperity elsewhere in Britain. And then and this was a big deal at the time, distressed areas, capital D, capital A. People were constantly talking about the distressed areas. And these were certain specific locations, Glasgow, South Wales, Ulster, Tyneside. There were just certain specific areas and these were the old industrial areas, and the shipbuilding areas in particular, or the coal mining areas, heavy industry areas. And they experienced extreme poverty by comparison with what they'd known, whereas other parts of Britain, there was comparative prosperity. And so prosperous people in the home counties bought books about the distressed areas and read articles in newspapers about the distressed areas. And it was like a foreign country to them because the conditions were so poor in these areas. So there was a publisher named Gollancz, Victor Gollancz. And by the way, I work in book publishing, and I've been working in book publishing for the last 40 years. And so I think of everything from the point of view of what it's like to work for a book publisher. So Victor Gollancz had a bit of success because they published the Lord Peter Wimsey detective thrillers, and they were very successful. And what Victor Gollancz decided to do with the money he'd made in this publishing company was to start something called the Left Book Club. The Left Book Club was a huge, vibrant movement. It was much more than a book club. Most book clubs, when you see a book club, it's someone who runs a book club and they buy print runs from other publishers, a mix of other publishers. The Left Book Club was different. It was one publisher published all the volumes, and they had a huge influence on left-wing intellectuals in that period. When I first came to Chicago in the 80s, I would go into used bookstores and I would see these old left book clubs, and you could see them immediately because they had dark red covers and bright orange paper binders, and both of those had faded since the 1930s. And what was happening was that leftist intellectuals who lived in Chicago had bought these when they came out. Although it was a British thing, they had purchasers in the United States. And then when they died off, which was in the 1980s, their wives would shuffle these books into the local used bookstore, and so that you would see them everywhere. And then after a few years they stopped because that generation of left-wing intellectuals had stopped. But anyway, so there was this thing called the Left Book Club, and Gollancz first of all, he commissioned Orwell to go to the north of England, which was one of the worst. There were certain spots in the north of England which were particularly outrageous for their poverty, and write about it. And what Orwell did was he wrote The Road to Wigan Pier, right? And that's the first half of the book is all about the poverty in the north of England. The second half of the book is Orwell's views on everything. Everything political anyway, and a lot more besides. Capitalism, socialism, fascism, communism. Everything that Orwell thought about the world is in the second half of The Road to Wigan Pier. And what the two big things, not only did Orwell become a socialist with The Road to Wigan Pier, but he spills the beans about what he's thinking. There is very little documentary evidence about precisely what Orwell was thinking when he first went out to Burma for it. Almost none. There's no record of what he was thinking, really. We do know that by the end of his period in Burma, he was very strongly anti-empire, but we don't know precisely when that sentiment of being against the empire developed. And there's very little, and we're reduced to eyewitnesses or ear witnesses, people who had conversations with him, and it's been recorded that he would either say something good about the empire or something bad about the empire. Generally speaking, Orwell was in 1960s parlance was sort of into the negative, so he didn't like the imperial administration in Burma, but he didn't like the Burmese either. He had sympathy with the Burmese, but they also irritated him because he was constantly. At that time, Burma was probably the part of the British Empire where there was the most overt hostility towards the empire. You wouldn't get that in India, for example. And this is before there is any real nationalism against the empire. There's no real nationalist movement in Burma, but there were Buddhist monks who really disdained the empire and didn't conceal it. And so Burma was really unusual in that respect. And of course, when all the group of countries got their independence in 1948, but really in 47, but it was put into practice in 48. The India, Ceylon, and of course India became Pakistan as well, and Burma. Burma was the one that chose not to stay in the Commonwealth and not to play cricket with the English, right? All the others were quite willing to go along with that. In fact, if you look at people like Nehru and people like that, they're all public school boys who have a leftist disposition. They're all had the same sort of ideas, So of course they were able to organise the winding up of the empire, and they did it in a kind of Etonian fashion, those are a few things about. Oh yes, the other thing is this. So the road to Wigan Pier is conversion to socialism. The fact that we suddenly know a lot about what he's thinking in detail, which we didn't know before, and we can only guess at and conjecture. But the third thing is, it marks a shift from someone for whom politics was not central to someone for whom politics was really central, right? From the road to Wigan Pier on, everything, and Orwell said this several times in different ways. He was no longer a pure novelist or a pure writer. He was a politically committed, and he actually said every word I've written has been about democratic socialism, right? So he's completely possessed from 1936 on by the fact that politics, I think of Mao Zedong, put politics in command, right? Well, that's what Orwell did, put politics in command. So that was the significance of this shift in his views. So Orwell wrote The Road to Wigan Pier in 1936. He turned in the manuscript, and then immediately, like a couple of days later, went to Spain and took part in the Spanish Civil War. The Spanish Civil War began in 1936 and ended in 1939. April 1st, 1939, it was over. Orwell believed that, and it probably there was some truth in it, but there's been some dispute about this. In order to go, if you were a non-Spaniard and you wanted to go and fight in Spain for the left, and there were thousands who did, it was believed that you needed a letter of introduction from a left-wing group, right? Of some kind of left-wing group. So Orwell actually met Harry Pollitt, who was the leader of the British Communist Party of Great Britain, and tried to get him to give him a letter of introduction. And Harry Pollitt didn't like Orwell. For one reason or another, he refused to give Orwell a letter of introduction. And the vast majority of people who went to fight in Spain joined the International Brigades, as they were put, that was their official title, the International Brigade in each country. They were basically controlled by the Communist Party. That doesn't mean that all the people who fought in the International Brigade were communists, most of them weren't. But they were prepared to join this International Brigade, which was controlled by the Communist Party. But Orwell found that he couldn't get Pollitt to give him a letter of introduction. So instead, he got someone else of a left-wing persuasion, I think it was Fenner Brockway, to give him a letter of introduction to a particular grouping in Spain, which is always referred to as the POUM, Partido Obrero de Unificación Marxismo. So it was, as you can tell from its title, it was not a wide proletarian group, but a little group of intellectuals. And they were anti-Stalinist intellectual. So early on in the Spanish Civil War, you didn't join a general Spanish army if you were on the left. You joined particular militias of particular political persuasions. They were gradually changing that to one army, called the Popular Army. But that was only half complete. So Orwell, the result is Orwell ended up fighting for this peculiar tiny group, the militia of this peculiar tiny group of anti-Stalinist Marxists at the POUM. And he fought in the Spanish Civil War, and it was like the First World War, trench warfare. And if you saw something moving, you shot at it. Sometimes you'd make an advance and sometimes you wouldn't. And generally speaking, over the course of the Spanish Civil War, the nationalists made advances at the expense of the left, the Republicans. So that's why they eventually won, because they conquered all of Spain, bit by bit. So Orwell, although he was fighting for this POUM, which was everybody says Trotskyist, but it's not accurate. But he was like Trotsky in the sense that they had Marxist ideas, but they were anti-Stalin. Although he was fighting for them, he actually sympathized more with the Communist Party line. Because the Communist Party was adopting the view that we should keep quiet about the revolutionary aspects and just treat this as a democratic revolution, because that will get maximum support from other countries. So Orwell was fighting for the POUM, but actually more and more as time went on. First of all, he didn't like the inactivity. He wanted to see more action. And he was a macho kind of person. But secondly, he didn't agree with the POUM, although they were the militia he was fighting for. And in fact, he was organizing a group of people in the POUM to leave the POUM and join the International Brigade. And part of this was that the big prestigious place to fight was Madrid. And Madrid held out until the very end. The left made a point of holding out there because it was considered symbolic, even though they didn't use it as their capital. That became Valencia. Now Orwell had occasional leave, and whenever he had leave, he went into Barcelona. So the POUM only had any strength at all, any membership at all in Catalonia, and so Orwell was fighting on the the Aragon front. Actually, Aragon is the province to the west of Catalonia. But when he went into Barcelona, he kept on taking steps to arrange for him and a few other members of this POUM militia to leave the POUM. Of course, had to be done delicately because you don't want to be shot for desertion. To leave the POUM and go to Madrid, where it's really glamorous, lots of bloodshed, lots of fighting, and also where the communists, who were perceived as being much more sensible than the far left at this time, right? So the communists would refer to the POUM as ultra-left, but then they just call it Trotskyists. And since the communists were putting the line that the Trotskyists were in the pay of Hitler and Franco, they would just call them fascists. So there was no love lost between these two branches of the left in Spain. So on May 3rd, 1937, Orwell suddenly became involved in street fighting in Barcelona. So he was on leave from the front, and he was in Barcelona. And when I say street fighting, you have to understand this is with rifles and grenades. So this is street fighting Barcelona style, right? It's not somebody with a handgun sort of poking his head around a corner. This is serious stuff. And essentially there was civil war within the left in Spain. I could go into the causes of it and all that sort of thing, but it's probably more than you want to hear. But anyway, the result was that Orwell fell in with the POUM and the anarchists fighting the right wing of the Socialist Party, which was under the control of the communists. And it's important that it's the right wing of the Socialist Party, because they were the ones who, because the Communist Party was adopting this we are not revolutionary, we are bourgeois Democrats line, right? So that recommended itself to a lot of middle-class socialists who are on the right wing of the Socialist Party in Spain. Anyway, so there was this bitter fighting, and when that fight, basically the workers and who were anarchists and POUM members, they had to eventually they had to eat, they had to go back to work, so gradually they drifted back to work. Orwell returned to the front, and now he realized that his heart wasn't in this anymore. He realized that the communists were up to a lot of skullduggery. He was at the front only a day or two, and he was shot in the throat. He got a bullet in the throat. And the vast majority of times, if you get a bullet in the throat, you're going to die pretty quickly. But by chance, think about Donald Trump being shot in the ear. By chance, if God was looking out for Donald Trump, maybe he was looking out for Orwell in 1937, because it missed everything. Although for a long time his voice was very hoarse because it grazed the vocal cords, and he had to be hospitalized. So after a month or two of being hospitalized, he came back to, by the way, Orwell's wife had gone to Barcelona and got an office job with the POUM in order to be able to meet him occasionally. And so his wife was in Barcelona as well. So Orwell came back from hospitalization, walked into the hotel in Barcelona, and his wife ran up to him and says, "Shh, don't say anything." And basically, what had happened here is a totalitarian police state had been imposed in Barcelona, and anybody who had any connection with the POUM was being rounded up, jailed, and probably killed. And so Orwell and his wife had to sleep rough for a few nights and then get out and go through France to Britain. And when he got back to Britain, Orwell found that the communist account of what had happened in Spain was everywhere. Not quite everywhere, but it was very widely disseminated. The whole idea that these were Trotskyists in the pay of Franco and Hitler, and were trying to sabotage the war and in order to benefit Nazi Germany and Franco. This was being widely accepted, and Orwell was furious about this, and so eventually, and he also found that when he attempted to write anything contrary to this, it couldn't get published in the great majority of organs, including the New Statesman, which was a very, very powerful influence among left-wing intellectuals in England at that time. They wouldn't publish anything critical of the communists in Spain, even in the correspondence columns, because they thought it would give strength to the nationalists. By the way, the left always referred to the nationalists as the fascists. But this is part of the name calling and so on. They weren't. The great majority of them weren't fascists. But anyway. So Orwell eventually wrote the book. A few months later, he wrote the book Homage to Catalonia, which is all about his experiences in Spain. And that's how he became a strong adherent of the anti-Stalinist, the revolutionary anti-Stalinist left. So that was Orwell's position from June 1937 until the early morning hours of August 23rd, 1939. But of course, after that, he became pro-war, but he still retained a lot of these other extreme left ideas. So he became very pro-war, and in fact got a job with the BBC, and a lot of his imagery when he's talking about the state in 1984 is based on his work for the BBC, because he was in charge of propaganda at the BBC. And a lot of people have this idea that Orwell was honest to a fault. Orwell was not honest to a fault. He was quite prepared to spread lying stories if he thought they would benefit Britain at the expense of Germany, right? And room 101 was a room in the BBC. So he gave that to this room in 1984, where nobody wants to know what goes on in there. Right? It's the worst thing in the world goes on in room 101. Anyway, so this is Orwell having a bit of fun. So Orwell now is he's still basically a revolutionary anti-Stalinist, but on this one point he disagrees with them, and that is that he's in support of the war against Germany, and he keeps on saying, although he says that we have to fight this war against Germany, he keeps on saying that the only way we're going to win is if we have a socialist revolution in Britain. He repeatedly states that. We can't win unless we have a socialist revolution. This was actually quite a common view at the time. J.B. Priestley, who was by far the most popular writer in England at that time, had a series of radio talks, and he put this line. He didn't call it a socialist revolution. That might have been asking for trouble, but he said to have radical democratization, because the British military was very undemocratic. I mean, it's almost a joke to even say that. There was no way for a working class person who signed up as a private ever to become an officer. A corporal maybe, but not a captain. Orwell said over and over again, we can't win this war without a socialist revolution. Of course, we did win the war. We did win the war without a socialist revolution, although, of course, it was mainly the Soviet Union that won the war, with a little bit of help from the Americans and a tiny bit of help from the Brits. But that doesn't seem to have been Orwell's main point. In fact, I think Orwell always underrated the contribution of the USSR to the war against Germany. He always thought that we were winning when we were winning, which was towards the end. And they didn't realize that all the heavy lifting was being done by the Stalinist regime. So, should I say any more?
Sure.
if you have,
Well, it's 5:15, so I don't know.
Oh. well, I lost track of time.
Yeah, sorry, yeah, just.
Yeah. Time flies when the talk is so entrancing.
Yeah. What about just doing a Q&A now? Like, I think.
Yeah, sure.
Would that be
Yeah.
more?
Yeah, I have a question. He was a leftist, but he was against, in the book Animal Farm in 1984, he seemed to be against the takeovers. I always thought of Animal Farm as being a parody against the Soviet Union.
Yeah, yeah.
And I wonder if you could clear that whole thing up.
Well, yeah, Orwell held a number of views, and to some of us they may seem not entirely coherent, but we can only, I try to establish precisely what he believed. Orwell believed that not only was socialism the right thing, because capitalism was such a terrible system, but he also believed that the end of capitalism was absolutely inevitable, or that capitalism is doomed. He was absolutely convinced of this, and he was convinced of this on grounds of economics and industrial organization, and Orwell knew absolutely nothing about economics or industrial organization. And it reminds me of people that I sometimes talk to who tell me that we're threatened with extinction because of global warming. And when you talk to them, they know absolutely nothing about atmospheric physics. So it's like that. And this brought home to me very powerfully that in any generation, the intellectuals are absolutely committed to things which they personally don't have very good arguments for, and which 50 years later everybody will say was a lot of nonsense. And so, I mean, whatever you think about capitalism, it was not in its final throes in the 1940s, right? It's looking a lot healthier today than it did then. And so, but Orwell was convinced that, remember, Orwell had a short life, died at the age of 46. I think you can say that if he'd lived another 20 years, he would have maybe ceased to be a socialist. This seems highly likely. And that's the general trajectory. People do become less socialist as they get older, if they survive. You see, I was a Marxist in the 1960s, and I became a libertarian in the early 70s. And so I can see how all this, you know, from personal experience, I can see how people can think certain ways. So yes, Orwell defined socialism. One of the things about Orwell is this: that in my view, there are no really significant original thoughts in Orwell, none. But he does have a way of sharply formulating certain ideas that were known about and were talked about by others, but he expresses them in a very sharp way. So in that sense, you know, he made a contribution to clarity of thinking. So Animal Farm is based very closely on the Russian experience, even though it's a very English story, right? So, and in fact, it's so much based on the Russian experience that Orwell made changes to his first draft to comply with what had happened in Russia. And there's one thing where everybody here has read Animal Farm, I'm sure. So the animals take over the farm and kick out the humans. The pigs become the ruling group among the animals, and they start to become more and more like the humans were. So and it ends up with them being indistinguishable from the humans. And the pigs are the intellectuals who become the ruling class, and they exploit the animal. One important thing is they exploit the animals even worse than the humans did. It's not that they're just the same. The pigs are much worse, and Orwell was in no doubt that workers in Soviet Russia were much worse off than they were in the West. But on the other hand, although he thought that, he thought that we in the West were going towards the kind of society they had in Soviet Russia. So he didn't think this was something to brag about, because he thought it was doomed. What was going on in the West was doomed. So,
Well, both sides, both were doomed. I mean, the communists as well as the capitalists, it seems. At the end, they just sort of, it was hard to distinguish one from the other.
Mhm.
And, I mean, that's what I thought he was trying to say, that there really isn't. I mean, that everybody had, there was idealistic values and outlook and whatnot, but in the end, greed and corruption and took over from both the communists as well as the capitalists were doing it initially, and then the communists, as sort of as parallels what was happening in the Soviet Union, with all these well-intentioned ideas, but then it didn't really manifest.
right. I mean, if you were looking at this from the point of view of the 1990s, you would have to say that capitalism won
Yeah.
and Soviet socialism lost. Now, of course, since then, things have been happening in the United States and other countries which are very ominous, in my view, and which is not such a triumphant story. But anyway, the point is that Orwell believed that this was happening. Now, Orwell did actually. It wasn't the predominant tenor of what he said, but towards the end, Orwell did say that it's possible that the future may lie with totalitarianism. And in other words, we can't escape it. And I should say this, by the way, the word totalitarian began in the early 1920s. And it comes from liberal Italian critics of Mussolini, who accused the fascist movement of being totalitarian. And Mussolini picked up on this and said, "Yeah, that's good. That's good." So he said, "Yeah, that's just what we are. We're totalitarian." So they adopted it proudly, but it became. It has a shifting. This whole books have been written about the usages of the word totalitarian in the West, and one usage by one particular group of people was the idea that fascism and Bolshevism were the same thing. So you get people talking in the 30s talking about brown Bolshevism and what would be the counterpart, red fascism, and brown, because the brown shirts were the most visible sign of the thuggishness of the Nazi regime. Now, of course, there came a point where Hitler purged the brown shirts and reduced them to comparative impotence. And the SS became more powerful, which people thought was great because the SS were more gentlemanly and had better table manners. But that was not necessarily an advantage. Orwell wrote something in which he said it's likely that the future lies with totalitarianism. And Victor Gallant wrote to him and said, "Are you really that pessimistic?" And Orwell wrote back and said, "Well, it's one of my worries. This is not the word for word. Maybe there is hope for some alternative, but right now it looks as though everything's leading to totalitarianism. He said the test case will come if we have a country with really strong liberal, and he meant of course liberal in the sense of being in favour of personal freedom and freedom of expression and so on. A country like England, which has really powerful liberal traditions, introduces socialism. Then we'll find out. Of course, what Orwell didn't foresee, and again this is just my view, is that when you introduce a lot of state control, you change people's mentality and you change people's principles, and people with liberal principles, they start to modify their liberalism away from liberalism and they become more totalitarian. So it works that way as well. But anyway, Orwell was aware of this, of the possibility that he boxed himself in to a situation where totalitarianism was the only possible future. And he didn't like it. I mean, he thought this was horrible, but he couldn't see any escape because he didn't think there was any chance for capitalism to make a comeback. Orwell wrote a review of The Road to Serfdom by F.A. Hayek in early to mid 1944. So he wrote that review around the time a momentous event was happening, to wit, I was being born. So Orwell wrote this review of F.A. Hayek, and it's very short, and it's even more short when you realize it's a joint review. He's reviewing two things. He's reviewing a book by The Road to Serfdom by F.A. Hayek, and a book by a guy whose name was Conquistador. And that's a kind of Latinized Finnish name, although he was thoroughly domesticated into English life. He was a well-known MP, a left-wing MP. And so he begins the review by saying, one of these books tells us that unrestricted capitalism will lead to totalitarianism or fascism, I forget which term he used. And the other book tells us that socialism will lead to fascism. The tragedy is they may both be right. So that's the opening of that review. And one of the things he says in that, and you see how his mind is thinking. You see, one of the reasons why leftists were so convinced that capitalism destroys itself and becomes totalitarian is because they argue that competition destroys itself. You get more and more big monopolies and they take over everything, right? So that's where Orwell has the famous line, the trouble with competitions is that someone always wins them. So anyway, so he knew, Orwell knew that there were people who were arguing for a return to laissez-faire, like F.A. Hayek. And of course, since then, F.A. Hayek really is the beginning of the revival of classical liberalism. That book marks the beginning of a really powerful intellectual movement to go back to laissez-faire capitalism, if you like. That's one way to put it. Anyway, to go back to classical liberal ideals and principles. But at the time, it was a very minor part of the political landscape. And Orwell said in that review, it's worth reading Hayek, even though his ideas are so unfashionable. And you see, the thing about Orwell is he develops a very sure touch when it comes to persuasion. And what Orwell meant in that short review of those two books was, you should read Hayek. But he didn't say that. Because you see that what he was doing was he was saying the only objection you can have to Hayek is that he's out of fashion. That was his term. Is that he's out of fashion. So most respectable left-wing intellectuals in 1944, I'm not going to dismiss things because they're out of fashion, right? So that would make them sympathetic to Hayek, and that's what Orwell was doing. So he liked the idea but he thought it was hopeless. Now he might have changed his view later.
When did he die?
January 1950.
Oh, so the world has changed dramatically since. So what do you think his take would be now with the current situation?
Right. Well, you know, of course, it's all speculation, and we don't really know. I mean, many people have accused Orwell of being a McCarthyist, right? Because Orwell combined, and the reason that came to my mind is because the first speech that Senator McCarthy, otherwise known as Tail Gunner Joe, made about the communists was the month after Orwell died. So in all likelihood, Orwell had never heard of McCarthy. But so what happened was Orwell compiled this list of people. When the Labour government came in 1945, you have to understand the Labour government, by any usual standards in a Western democracy, was extremely left-wing. They nationalised 1/5 of the British economy in a couple of years. They also did some great things like getting out of India. Not getting out, but you know, giving up the empire. But anyway, I'm losing my thoughts now. The Labour Party had all these views about socialism and so on, and they were extremely left wing. But this is the point I was going to make. They were extremely anti-communist. If anything, slightly more anti-communist than the Conservative Party. See, and you have to remember the whole history of communism. And I find today that people who are aged under 60 are not really aware of what communism was like. Basically, in 1919, there was a conference in Moscow that set up the Third International, the Communist International, right? There had been two internationals before, the international that Marx collaborated in, which the idea is uniting the workers of the world. So the first international came to an end because of dissension between socialists and anarchists and so on. The second international was the Social Democratic International, right? All these social democratic parties everywhere formed the second international, which still exists incidentally. The third international was the Communist International, right? They set up a communist party in every country of the world. So all the communist parties were set up in the years 1919 to 1921, all of them, without exception. Every country in the world got a communist party. And those communist parties were formed in the midst of old established left-wing socialist parties. And they had some degree of animosity towards these parties, because these were parties that identified with the Soviet model of how to get socialism, and they argued that it was playing into the hands of the capitalists to distract people from that. So they were very vigorously against all the old established socialist parties, one of which was the Labour Party, right? So there's this. The communist parties were absolutely under the control of Moscow. They also were discreetly funded by Moscow, and Moscow had changes of line, right? They would change whole policy, and every communist party in the world would immediately obey and change. So this was embarrassing to communists because they zigzagged all the time. They were always saying something different today than they'd, not always, but occasionally they were saying something different today to what they said last week. And it wasn't due to them all arriving at this, because they all happened in synchrony, all of them, all over the world. I mean, I suppose a dramatic example of this was that they'd been very anti-fascist. And then when the Hitler-Stalin Pact was announced, they all became, comparatively speaking, pro-Hitler. And in Britain, the communists always loved to form these front organizations. In Britain, they formed immediately in August 1939, they formed something called the People's Convention. And the People's Convention was really a campaign to accept Hitler's peace terms, because Hitler kept on offering peace, right? After the fall of France, the people in Germany were jubilant. They thought, this is it, we've won, and that Britain is and France are going to, well, France, what's left of it, they're going to sue for peace, and we can make concessions and we can get out of France and so on. But of course, by this time, the British had become more tenacious in being anti-German. They were not prepared to sort of just go home and forget about it. And so from then on, it was a war to the death. And soon the Allies was talking about unconditional surrender, which completely ruled out any compromised peace, right? We're going to fight until Nazi Germany is completely abolished. So this was the situation. So the Communist Party changed overnight from being very militantly anti-fascist to being against any anti-fascist war, and being pacifist, you might say, or at least strongly in favour of. They argued that this war that was going on now, because the war had started on the 3rd of September 1939, this war was due to British imperialism. And then, of course, 22nd of June 1941, Germany attacked Russia. And then, of course, all the communist parties all over the world immediately became the most militant anti-Nazis. They, in that case, they could be reasonably honest about it. They could say that the character of the war has changed, which is the phrase they kept using. The character of the war had changed because the Soviet Union was on the receiving end of the Germans now, and so But there are lots of minor things where you see that the Communist International decreed a change of policy, and everybody had to agree. Most people, as I say, people under 60 just don't appreciate what the communist movement was like. I mean, one thing that is of interest to me particularly, and it just shows. First of all, if you're a communist, you couldn't be in favour of abstract art. You couldn't be in favour of atonal music. You couldn't like Arnold Schoenberg. You couldn't be in favour of jazz. And you couldn't accept the legitimacy of genetics, right? Because Stalin fell in love with a person called Trofim Lysenko. Most people in the English-speaking world say Lysenko, but it's actually, I've listened to people, both Ukrainian and Russian, saying the name. It's Lysenko, and so he had this view that the inheritance of acquired characteristics, basically Lamarckism, a return of Lamarckism, and that it was possible by the way you treat embryos to change the species permanently and so on. And that prevailed that was absolutely official communist doctrine, and that means every member of every communist party in the world had to accept it. From let's see, something like 1935 until the ending of Nikita Khrushchev, because Stalin was a Lysenkoist and so was Khrushchev. Khrushchev wouldn't give up on that. So there were all these. So one of the things that happened in that whole period was that there were people who were biologists in the West who were and were sympathetic, because they were a lot of scientists were sympathetic to Soviet Russia, and they tended to be sympathetic. Suddenly they were confronted. They had to accept a biological doctrine that they believed, because of Western biological thinking, they believed to be nonsense, or they had to be against the Soviet Union. And in fact, this led to crises in the lives of some of these scientists. And it also led, Julian Huxley was a biologist and an orthodox Darwinist in every way, and he was quite sympathetic to the Soviet Union. But because accepting the Soviet Union meant accepting Lysenkoism, and therefore saying that genetics is all wrong and is a right-wing pseudoscience and misinformation and disinformation and so on, and imperialism. Because of that, he turned him against the Soviet Union. There was one notable scientist who was always conflicted, and that was JBS Haldane, who was a leading biologist and wrote a lot of interesting stuff. But he was very sympathetic to the Soviet Union, and the result was what he did was he just kept on equivocating and not coming clean on what he really thought, but allowing the inference that maybe Lysenko had something good about it, right? So, of course, much more recently, they discovered epigenetics, and a lot of people said, Lysenko was right, but in fact, that you can't make that. Lysenko was wrong. You can't. And of course, Lysenko was partly responsible for the failures of Soviet agriculture, because they thought that the application of genetics would have enabled them to make small, gradual, piecemeal improvements, but they couldn't do that because they had this wondrous, glamorous vision of the complete transformation of living things and of foodstuffs for human beings through Lysenkoism. But anyway, that's me going off at a tangent. Yeah, the communist parties were very strict, and they sometimes changed, and you had to comply with the change.
And they're different in each country.
Well, it was the same all over the world. Everybody all over the world, Communist Party members, had to change on the dot. Next day, there was no. You weren't. You'd be expelled if you. I mean, you could keep your ideas to yourself, of course, and there were people who did that. But if you publicly argued against the party line, you'd be expelled. Well, worse things could happen to you.
Well, we'll talk about that next week
All right.
at the College of Complexes.
Oh. All right. Well, thank you. I don't want to speak for everybody, but I feel like it's almost 6, so I have to get going.
Great.
Thank you.
So we usually go over. So of course, if you have to leave, you're free to leave. The set time is at 5:30, where we usually go over, and whenever, however long David is available and you're available, we can still keep talking.
Yeah.
And you can leave when you have to. Thanks, David, for this enlightening.
Oh, by the way, I should say, I do have a libertarian seminar which meets at my apartment, and it's about the same. Well, actually, we don't usually make quite this number, and it's about once a month. If anybody wants to be put on the list, you can give me your email.
Oh, no, I go there.
Maybe we don't wanna do this.
We've got one here.
Anybody wants to be on the list? I have one that works. I've had 4 pens die tonight, which is a record. There we go.
In your opinion, is the two-party system of the UK and the US better than the kind of coalition system?
I prefer it. I haven't really studied it at length, so but I do prefer it. I think if you see what's going on in Germany now, it's difficult to make. I'm biased because I want German policy to change greatly and become less pro-American and more multipolar in its approach to the world events and less inclined to go to war at the behest of NATO and so on. It tends to freeze things up, although I suppose in the case of Germany you've got Brussels to contend with. That's another immense bureaucracy carries a lot of weight. But yeah, I prefer the two-party system.
What about the hostility? You got a lot of negative campaigning. We certainly have it here, and I think probably have it in Britain as well. When you have 2 candidates, everything boils down to this or to that, to the left or the right, and there's no gray areas.
Right, but you don't escape that. You see, in Germany right now, in many parts of Europe, there is the rise of a party, or in some cases 2 parties, left and right, which is opposed to the current militaristic and Western-oriented, this is something to do with geopolitics, which my talk wasn't really. Yeah, I mean, but the AfD, which is the German party which everybody excoriates as extreme right-wing. Nothing extreme about them, but they're against the war in Ukraine, and they're against heavy unrestricted immigration. Those are the extreme right-wing aspects of but in other words, they hold views that quite recently would have been perfectly respectable.